Hey, we're going to continue in our David series today, and I was thinking about it this week, so I was like, how long have we been in David? So I looked back. We started the life of David on January 5th. So we've been, some here like, yeah, man, it's been a long journey, right? So we've been in David for just a little bit, and Brad's going to be back with us next week, and he is going to wrap up this series on the life of David. So Brad right now is at a 24-hour mountain bike race. He finishes in a half hour. It sounds terrible, right? I'm going to go ride my mountain bike for 24 hours. To me, that's not my thing, but Brad does it every year. He loves it. He also runs Bloomsday twice, so it tells you a little bit about who he is, which he's odd. But I was looking back. So after Brad wraps it up next week, we will have been in David for 21 weeks. So that's almost a half a year. And I hope you feel the same, because for me, it's been a lot of fun. I feel like I've learned a lot through this series, and God's spoken to me, and I hope you feel the same way. I hope it's encouraged you in your faith. We'll be wrapping that up next week. And what we've done in this series is we've looked at key events in the life of David, right? We've looked at crucial points and those kind of fork-in-the-road moments in David's life, and we've just looked and said, what is David going to do now? What's he going to do next? How do he handle this situation? And David did some unbelievable things, didn't he? Right? He's done some very unbelievable things. But he's also done some very foolish things and some very selfish things. He's done some impossible things. And through all that, if you just think for a moment about all of the stuff that David's done, that we've talked about in this series, right? David killed Goliath, right? David fled, and he was living in caves, fleeing for his life for years, right? David became king of Israel. David and Bathsheba, right? We looked at that a couple weeks ago. David then murdered his friend to cover up this affair he had with Bathsheba. I mean, David has done highs and lows throughout this series. Yet, in the midst of all that, what we see is that the Bible tells us that David is a man after God's own heart. Everything that he's been through, the Bible says this right here, this man David is a man after my own heart. And I don't know about you, but I found myself asking, how's that possible? With everything David's done, good and bad, what did he do? Tell me, how is that possible? And as I thought about it this week, and kind of unpacked that a little bit, it's actually incredibly simple. It's not complicated how David became a man after God's own heart. And so we're going to look at that this morning. And what we're going to do is we're going to step out of the book of 2 Samuel, right? The life of David kind of starts in 1 Samuel. It moves into 2 Samuel. That's where we've been the last weeks, 21 weeks. And we're going to move out of 2 Samuel. We're going to move over to the book of Psalms. And as we do this, I want to look at David's heart. I don't want to, because what we've done a lot in this series is we've looked at David's actions, we've looked at David's failures, we've looked at what can we glean from this thing that David does? How does he respond in this specific situation? And I don't want to look at any of those things, and I just want to look at David's heart. I want to look at how David cultivated this life where he became known as a man after God's own heart. Because at the end of the day, for you and I, at the end of our life, if we don't accomplish what we believe to be great things, if God can look at us and say, man, you're a man after my own heart, you're a woman after my own heart, isn't that enough? Isn't that what we want? And so we're going to look at that. And so if you have your Bibles, you can turn with me to Psalm 23. If not, in just a few moments, it'll be up on the screen behind me. Many of you are probably very familiar with this psalm. This is arguably David's most famous psalm, right? Psalm 23. A lot of you probably have a coffee mug with Psalm 23 written on it at your house. You drink coffee out of every morning. Man, I'm spiritual. Nice little drink there. Right? It's on a poster in your house, whatever it is. And we're going to unpack this a little bit. Before we do, the Psalms, just so we're all on the same page, the Psalms are songs. Okay, they're written as songs. That's what they are. And there are 150 Psalms in our Bible, 73 of which David himself wrote. And so all through his life, as things are happening, as circumstances are unfolding in David's life, what we see is David is penning these songs. He's writing these songs to God. And we're going to look at one of those today. before we get to Psalm 23, I want you to think back to your childhood with me for just a minute, okay? Think back to your childhood, and some of you are like, man, that's a few days ago. Think back to your childhood, and I want you to think of your favorite kid stories that stuck out to you. If you grew up in the church, inevitably you learned kid Bible stories back in the day, right? I didn't grow up in this type of church. I didn't grow up learning kids Bible stories, but I know a handful of you, most of you maybe have. And so what are those stories that come to mind as you think back to your childhood? What are the stories that stood out to you most? Stories like David and Goliath, right? David and Goliath obviously were in David, but that's one that stands out. My boys, when they learn about David and Goliath in kids' church, they come home and they want to fight me all of a sudden. They're like, Dad, you're Goliath. And they get their swords out and they start hitting me. And I'm like, guys, he didn't use swords. They're like, you're right, we're going to go get rocks. It's like, no, use the sword, But stories like Jonah, right? That's another one we learn. It's like Jonah was in the belly of the whale. Or what are other ones? Noah, right? Maybe you heard the story of Noah. That's one that sticks out in your mind. The funny thing about Noah being a kid's story to me is it's about God like destroying the entire population. We're like, hey, look what God did, guys. And he had a boat and giraffes. Their heads stick out. But there's something about our faith as a young child, as a young boy, as a young girl, where we believed God could do anything. Where we believed that God was going to do the impossible, where we looked at those stories of Noah and Daniel and Jonah, and we just said, man, my God's amazing. But the longer we're in our faith, the longer we're following Jesus, something tends to happen. And we begin to gain more knowledge, and we become more studious, and we become more mature. And as we do that, I think we tend to lose that excitement of just being a little kid who read this story and said, man, my God's amazing. And as I was preparing this week, one of the questions I found myself asking is do we still believe that God can do anything? Do you still believe that God can do anything, that God can do the impossible in your life? Do you believe that the story of Noah actually happened? Do you believe that Jonah truly lived in the belly of a whale? Like, is that something you believe, or is that just a really good story that points us to the person of God? Or what about Elijah, right? Elijah called down fire from heaven. Do you believe you could call down fire from heaven? Or is that just something that's a good idea? Like, it's good to read about, but I don't believe that's true. The Bible tells us, talking about Elijah in James 5:17, that Elijah called down fire from heaven, but Elijah was a man just like you and I, right? That his nature was the same as ours. Which means that these guys, Noah, Daniel, David, Elijah, these guys are no different than you and I. But in our culture today, there's a premium on logic. There's a premium on intellect. And not that there's anything wrong with being smart, being intellectual. I'm not frowning on that. But there's such a premium on logic and intellect in our culture that we just tend to move away from that childlike faith that says, man, I believe God can do anything. Where we just believe that God was going to do something big. That faith that where we were excited to tell people about Jesus, where we were excited to tell people about what we'd read in the Bible. What happened to just believing that God would do something great and amazing in your life, not because of what you've done, not because of anything you're going to do, but just believing he can do it because he's God, because he wants to. And in all his greatness, in all his glory, David was a man just like you and I. And I've got to fight, and I think you've got to fight to believe that's true. We've got to fight to believe that David truly, although he did some great things, he's no different than us. He's just a man like you and I. Which means that we have to stop believing the lies that tell us you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not intellectual enough, you don't know your Bible well enough. We have to quit believing that there are more qualified people out there to do the work of Jesus. David wasn't the most qualified guy, right, to become king. But what happened? That's who God chose. And that's what's so awesome about this psalm. Man, it's good. David is so bold with his words. He has this mindset that believes, my God will do anything. My God is going to do amazing things just because I believe in him. Now, as we unpack this, remember the Psalms are songs, so they're a little different than what we're used to reading. And so that being the case, I want to make sure that we don't just tear the Psalms apart, right? There's something in us as we grow that says, man, I just need to know the Greek, and I need to get in here, and I need to figure this stuff out, and I need you to just lay it all out there for me. I don't want to do that with this psalm. I don't want to just tear this thing apart. I want us to see David's heart. Because something we do as Bible teachers, as people who are learning, as Christians in general, is we tend to tear things apart. We tear the Bible apart and always look for that deeper meaning. And I just want us to appreciate the beauty of David's words. And I was thinking about it this week. It'd be like if you and I tried to tear apart and look for the deeper meaning in Humpty Dumpty, okay? Truly, track with me for a second here, okay? I spent time thinking about this week. Humpty Dumpty, like, what is he? An egg? That's it. Seriously, Humpty Dumpty's just an egg. How'd he get on the wall? A ladder? Where'd the ladder go? Did a crane drop him there? Did like one of his homies get down and like, Humpty, I'll get up? And where'd his friend go? Right? We tend to do this with the Bible. We just start to tear it apart and look for the deeper meaning, and sometimes we miss the heart of what's happening. Here's the thing that really bothers me about Humpty Dumpty. Here's the thing that really gets me. At the very end, it says this. It says, all the king's horses and all the king's men. What's a horse going to do to help an egg? Like, he doesn't have fingers, and he's not I digress. Here's my point. I don't want us to do that with this psalm. I want us to catch David's heart. This is a song that he wrote to God. And so we're going to do that. Okay, here it is, Psalm 23. We're going to read it in its entirety, verses 1 through 6. It says this, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me into righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That was written as a song. And what David's saying there, I think, is absolutely amazing. Do you see his confidence in God, his heart for God in Psalm 23? And I know I said let's be careful not to tear this apart, but let's unpack this just a little bit so we make sure we understand what's happening in this psalm. And so David starts and he says, the Lord is my shepherd. David doesn't say the Lord is the shepherd, the Lord is a shepherd. He says, no, the Lord is my shepherd. It's a personal relationship between David and God. David's saying, if he is no one else's shepherd, he is my shepherd. That there's a relationship between him and David, between God and David, where God says, I know God's got me. He is my shepherd. He is going to lead me. I am going to follow him. He watches over you. He restores you. He protects you. What's the job of the shepherd? Plain and simple, the job of the shepherd is to protect the sheep, right? His one job, protect the sheep. That's your job as a shepherd. David knew this. David was a shepherd himself. Remember, before he was anointed king, he was a shepherd. And so as he says, the Lord is my shepherd, he's saying, man, I'm following God. This is a personal thing for him. And then he follows it up and he says, I shall not want. And as I read, I shall not want, I'm like, that's a cool statement right there, David. Thank you for that, right? I'm cool with the Lord's my shepherd. Yeah, I'm tracking. I'm on board with that. I shall not want. Wait a minute. What do you mean I shall not want? Guys, I don't know if you're like me, but I could spend the rest of our time today telling you about all the things I want. Okay, I could just do it from memory and just go and go and go. I could get my wife up here right now and be like, hand her the microphone, hey baby, tell them. And she'd be like, he wants this, he wants this, he wants this. The man never stops wanting things. From memory. And so what's David saying, I shall not want? What he's saying here is he's saying, as long as the Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing on this earth that I will need. As long as the Lord is my shepherd, there's nothing I could possibly need in my life. You see, the difficulty for you and I is we get our wants and our needs confused sometimes, don't we, right? And all of a sudden, like, we get them so confused that they become one, and they're like, I don't know if that's a want or a need, but I'm going to go get it anyway, right? I'm just going to handle this. I'm going to take care of it because I think I need it, although I really want it. And David understood the difference. He said, man, God can supply my every single need. Verse 2, he says this. He says, he makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. What he's talking about there is peace, that God gives me peace. If some of you in your backyard, by your deck, by your patio, you have like a little water feature, right? Or you have like the waterfall or whatever it is. And we like sitting by those things because they're peaceful, right? Oh man, it's like it's so peaceful by this. That's what David's saying here. He's like, man, God brings me into these places of peace in my life. Verse 3, he restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. He leads me to these places. He leads me to peace. He himself restores my soul. When my soul's sorrowful, he revives it. He brings it back to life. When my soul's sinful, he sanctifies it. When my soul's weak, he makes it strong. And then this next verse, this is my favorite verse in the entire psalm, and this is where we're gonna camp out for probably the remainder of our time today. And it says this in verse 4, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. As I read that, and this is, I'm going to say this, and this is going to be an incredibly generational statement, but as I read, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I hear Coolio's voice in my head right now. Anybody know who Coolio is? Can you relate with that? Okay, yeah, a couple people, definitely a generational thing, but Coolio sings this song, and that's all I hear. I hear Coolio, and then I picture his face. If you don't know who Coolio is, go Google him. You're going to see a great picture of Coolio. It's fantastic. If you don't know what Google is, I don't know what to tell you. Like, Encyclopedia Coolio. I mean, I don't know what to tell you right there. Back on track. Some of you are like, what? Don't ever talk about Coolio in church again. I won't. The valley of the shadow of death, okay? The shepherd's job is always to protect the sheep. And in protecting the sheep, the shepherd's job is to lead the sheep from point A to point B in the easiest, safest route. That's how they protect the sheep. I'm going to get you from here to here in the safest, easiest manner. But inevitably, as the shepherd leads the sheep, you come up on terrain that's difficult. You come up on places, on dark valleys. You come up on places where you don't really want to take the sheep into, because as you take the sheep into these dark places, inevitably, death for the sheep is looming around the corner. It's not safe. There's a lot of trees around, or picture like a really big, deep, dark ravine. The sun doesn't get to the bottom of this very much, big cliffs on each side. And the shepherd takes the sheep through there, and you just feel the eyes watching you as you walk through. You could be attacked at any moment. And here's David, this guy who says, I'm not afraid of that. If I asked you to raise your hand and said, how many of you get scared in the woods at night by yourself? Most of you probably wouldn't raise your hand, but my guess is there's a handful of you, myself included, who gets in the woods at night and you just get a little scared. Like your mind just starts to do that thing where you're just like, man, something's watching me right now and I know it. You're like, I don't know where it's at. It sees me. I'm just, you're like, I'm going to walk a little faster. And all of a sudden you're lost and then it's worse. But David says, nah, forget that. I'm not scared. And David says, I'm not afraid, not because I'm tough David, not because I killed Goliath, not because I have, a knife, or not because I know karate or whatever. But he says, no, I'm not scared because my faith in my God is fearless. My faith in my God knows God has got me covered. Am I living my life with a fearless faith that knows God's got me covered? Are you living your life with fearless faith that knows, man, God's got me covered? And that doesn't mean it's going to be always exciting and fun and easy, but God's got me covered. Am I stepping out in my faith in a way that says, God's got me covered? I'm going to follow him in the difficult and the hard. Are you trusting God in your conversations with people? Are you trusting God in your health and in your finances and in your job and in any other aspect of your life that says, God's got me. He's going to take care of me. But what tends to happen is we say, man, yeah, God's got me. I believe that. And what we do is we kind of put these things in play that protect ourselves, right? Just in case God doesn't got me, I'm going to protect myself, right? And which says, I don't truly believe that God's got me covered. And we begin to protect ourselves from walking through the valleys, right? I don't want to walk through the valley, so I'm just going to protect myself from that by being smart, by being intelligent, by putting a plan in place. Because if I have a plan and I follow my plan, then I can't end up in the valley. But if I believe that Jesus has got me covered in some really sick and twisted way, shouldn't I just kind of want to walk through the valley of the shadow of death just to see what God does? I mean, I know it's perverse thinking a little bit, but if I truly believe God's got me covered, why don't I kind of want to walk through this valley and say, God, show up and show me something amazing. Do something amazing like only you can do. But what tends to happen is what we say is, man, God, you can make me lie down in pastures all day. I'm good with that, right? I'll take a little nap. God, you can lead me by the still waters. But God, don't lead me to the valley, because the Spokane Valley is terrible. If you live in the valley, I'm kidding, okay? I know there's people here from the valley. We love the valley. It's a great place. It wasn't in my notes. I'd get in trouble. But God, lead me to the nice places. Don't lead me to the difficult. Don't lead me to the hard. Don't lead me into the valley. That's not okay with me. Traditional mature thinking says it would be foolish of you to let your shepherd lead you into the valley. Don't ever go there. It doesn't make sense. Don't allow your shepherd to lead you into the valley where it's going to be hard, it's going to be difficult. A responsible person just isn't going to allow that to happen. And then there's David, this man after God's own heart, who says, you know what, God? I'm going to follow you anywhere. You take me wherever you want to take me, and I'm going to follow you. Do you have that kind of faith that says, man, God, just take me, and I'm going to follow? I'm not going to put my protection plan in play. I'm not going to put the safety net there so that when you don't come through and I fall, I have a plan. Do you have that kind of faith? Because if I'm perfectly honest with myself, there was a season of my life where I lost that faith. I didn't have that faith. Difficult situations would happen in my life. Things wouldn't go the way I planned, the way I hoped, the way I wanted. And I find myself just questioning, God, what are you doing? What are you thinking? This is a mess, God. How are you in control? How do you have me covered in this? And in those moments, what I had to do is I had to remember to look back at the things in my life that God's done. Look back at the provisions. Look back at the things where God has come through. And bring myself to this place that says, I'm not going to start questioning God now because it's hard. Because everything that God's done in my life up to this point has been great. And just because it's hard doesn't mean I can just start questioning God all of a sudden saying, whoa. The valley's tough, God. I don't think you know. There's no reason I should be here in front of you today, getting to share, getting to stand up here. But God did in my life what only God can do. And all I did was I allowed him to lead me into some pastures and by some waters, and I followed him through some valleys. And it wasn't all rainbows and sunshine, but I'm here. When my first son was born, my wife and I, he's 4 right now. He was up here on stage with us. When he was born, my wife and I, we brought him home from the hospital, And it's funny how, like, when you have this baby, they just, like, the hospital's like, okay, have fun. Like, okay, what do I do with this thing now? You know, you don't really know. As new parents, we knew nothing about parenting a child. And so we brought him home, and our first night home, it was miserable, to be honest. And it wasn't miserable because we weren't getting the rest we wanted to get. It was miserable because we literally got 1 hour of sleep, probably cumulative, over the course of the night. There was just something that wasn't right. And the next morning, whatever morning happened, I mean, it was all kind of blurred, but the next day, when the sun came up, it was like the same thing. It was like, there's something wrong. Like, he's broken. How do I fix him? And so we called our doctor, and we're like, hey, I know we're new, and you probably get this a lot, but we don't know what's going on. He's like, hey, sure, come on, bring him in. We brought him into the doctor, and we were in the doctor's office just a few moments, and the doctor came into our room, and he said, I'm admitting you to the hospital. Dang it, man. This is the third time today. I'm admitting you to the hospital. He said, I don't know what's wrong, but there's something wrong with your son. Man. Someone open the door. I think the pollen's pretty high in here right now. Allergies are flared up. And so we kind of rushed over to the hospital, and we didn't know what was going on, and we just like, okay, here we go. And all my wife and I could do was just pray. Stop crying. All we could do was pray. God, do something. Do what only you can do. I'm thinking about sunshine and rainbows right now. Just literally, that's what's in my head. Humpty Dumpty. They did every test imaginable on our son. Blood work to spinal tap to everything you can think of. Put him in a little cage. It was the worst week of my life. But you know what? We made it through. Why doesn't Brad ever cry? Guy doesn't have a soul. Mike, can you erase that from the video, please? We got through it. You saw my son, he's up here. He's healthy. It's good. What we're talking about today, this type of faith, this type of countercultural faith, it's not easy. People are going to look at you in your life and they're going to say, what are you doing? What are you thinking? That does not make any sense. You need to think about this. You need to step back. You need to get some perspective. People are going to say that because fearless faith in God is countercultural. I'll give you another example. This one's other end of the spectrum, but another example I can't do anymore. Well, they're going to make me cry. Another end of the spectrum. When my wife and I, when we were at our other church, we prayed and we felt like God said, hey, I want you to give a significant amount of money to this church. And we're like, are you sure? And he's like, yes, I want you to give this amount of money. And he gave us a number, and it was an incredibly uncomfortable number for my wife and I. And so I went back to God. I said, hey, God, that's a little high, don't you think? And he's like, you don't have faith? And I said, no, I have faith. He goes, okay, raise it. Thanks, God. Lesson learned there, right? You don't get in a little prayer battle with him. You won't win. But he said, raise it. So we prayed more, and we said, all right, we'll raise it. And at the end of the day, we ended up giving what would equate to 1/3 of my salary to this church. We had people in our life going, you're nuts. What are you thinking? You have a family. You have to protect yourself. That doesn't make sense. That's what I heard God. That's what I heard God say. I'm going to do it. I'm going to follow him. Some of you know this part of my story, but before I was in ministry, I had 90% plus of a biochemistry degree. I had it 90% of the way completed. And God said, okay, pal, you're done now. No, I'm almost done. You're right. Good observation, God. I am almost finished. No, you're done now. Okay. So I walked away. And people in my life are like, what are you doing? That's foolish. You're almost finished. That's what I heard God say. What I told God was, it would have been cool if you would have told me this 4 years ago, dude, save me some bucks, some time. But that's what I heard God say. And so I walked away. But every time God provided, every time God had a plan, every time God prevailed, He had me covered. Well, in that story where we gave money to the church, time and time again, there would come bills and be like, how's this one going to get paid for? And then a check shows up, like, oh, cool, where'd this come from? Bing, paid the bill, right? So someone shows up at our house, like with a dryer or something, like, hey, I bought 2 on accident. Like, what? Who buys 2 dryers? That didn't happen, but that'd be pretty sweet if it did. But God had us covered. He took care of us. And you know why? You know why we were able to do those things, why my wife and I were able to walk through that? Is because we believe that our God had never failed us and that He wasn't going to start failing us now. We're able to walk through these situations in our life and believe God's got me covered because God's never failed me and God's not going to start failing me now. That's it. We believe that to be the case. And so all we were able to do was look back on our life and say, God's not failing us now. In the past, He's not going to fail us now. But you're older, but you have kids. You need to be responsible. You need to think about this. But you know what? I have the same shepherd now as I did when I was a young boy. I have the same shepherd now as I did when I first started believing in Jesus, when I believed all those stories to be true, right? I still believe them to be true for the record. But that faith of a young kid, we have the same shepherd now as we did when we were young boys and girls. And so let's get back to that place that says, man, my God's amazing. My God is with me, and my God has got me covered, and because of that, I can do the impossible. But I believe there are people in this room who have been talked out of the things God has called you to do. You've been talked out of them by yourself. You've been talked out of them by other people. You've been talked out of them by our culture because it just doesn't make sense. You've been talked out of having grace for a person who's incredibly hard to love, and wisdom says, just be done with them. Don't have grace for them anymore. But God says, no, you need to do that, and so you do it. In your finances, God's asked some of you to give, and you said, nah, God, I can't handle that one. Or God said, hey, I want you to serve here. I want you to do this thing. Nah, man, I don't have the time for that, God. It doesn't make sense right now, not where I'm at in my life. Let's not be the types of people. Let's not be the Christians who play it safe. Let's not be the Christians who make calculated steps of faith. There's not that much remarkable about a calculated step of faith, but there's something incredibly remarkable about a fearless step of faith, trusting God's got me covered. Most of the greatest things in my life that I have are where I just went for it and just said, man, I heard from God and I'm going to go for it. I'm just going to do it. When I met my wife, the first day I met my wife, I heard God say, you're going to marry this girl. And so I just went for it. The problem was she had no idea and she didn't like me a bit. She thought I was a punk. And so I had my work cut out for me, right? And so I just went for it and I wore her down. And now she's here smiling at me thinking, this is the best decision I ever made, was to marry you. But I just went for it. I heard from God and I said, man, God, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to do this thing. It doesn't make sense always, but we just follow God. When my family moved up to be a part of Summit, right? We moved up here to be a part of this church. We lived on the north side. We had to sell much of what we had to move up here. And when I accepted the job, my wife and I, we sat down with Brad and Sherry, and they said, hey, why don't you pray about this thing? And we said, yeah, we'll pray about it. And then we heard clearly from God, and so we said, yeah, we'll take the job. And I accepted the job here at Summit without knowing anything about how much money I was going to make. It just never came up in conversation. And it didn't matter to me because I believe God had me covered. And some of you are like, well, that doesn't make financially, I mean, from a business perspective, caring for your family, that makes no sense. You're right, it doesn't. I had people tell me, like, you need to go figure that out before you truly do this thing. No, I don't. I'm good. And guess what? We're fine. God's got us. Now, please understand, I tell you these things from my life, not so that I can get up here and say, look what I've done. Look at my faith. It is so fearless. No. What I want you to see is, look what God's done. Look what God's done with a guy like me. I could tell you stories. I could tell you tons of stories about really poor choices I've made. That's not what we do on Sundays, okay? We don't use the time for that. But I tell you those stories to say, look what my God's done. My wife asked me this week, she said, hey, what do you want people to hear? As you get up and share, what do you want people to hear? And I said, all I want to do is I just want to get up and I just want to brag and boast about my God, because my God has never failed me, and my God's not going to start failing me now. And I just want people to know that, and I want people to see it, and I want to give them examples and say, look what God's done. And I would say the same for you. It's time to just start sharing our stories. Tell people, look what God's done in my life. Man, look at how amazing my God is. Yeah, it's not always rainbows and sunshine. It's not always easy, but my God has got me covered. He's never failed me. And he's not going to start now. What's God done in your life? Think about those things. I'm serious. Think about the things in your life where you can just look and go, man, God's hand was here. God's hand was here. Look what God did there. Don't forget those things. Tell people those stories, right? Brag and boast in your God, because he's amazing, because he can do the impossible. We have a section on our website that's just for stories. We'd love to hear, like, if you have something like, look what God did in my life. I was here and then God brought me here. Go on our website and share your story. And then we post it and allow other people to read it to encourage them. Some of you might be thinking right now, okay, I'm tracking with you. I've followed you. God's done some great things in your life. Thanks for sharing. But I don't have the same outcome in my life. God hasn't done the same amazing things in my life. Matter of fact, I've prayed specifically for something, for a person, for a situation, for years of my life, and God hasn't done anything. Or I felt like I heard God say something. I felt very clearly that I heard God's voice say, do this thing, and it just, or this thing's going to happen, and it just hasn't happened. Look back at David's life with me and think about it for just a second. Because David was anointed king of Israel, future king of Israel, at a very young age. And then he ran for his life. He fled. He had terrible things happen. It didn't go the way he thought it was going to go. And over 20 years later, guess what happened? God came through, right? God doesn't always work things out in our time, when we want, when we hope. God doesn't always answer all of our prayers. But that doesn't mean that God can't be trusted or that God doesn't care. Because he can. Fearless faith. That's what we're talking about today. That's what I want you to leave with, this idea of fearless faith. Do you believe that God can do the impossible, the unthinkable in your life?